This is a scene we take for granted in Australia, supermarkets full of good quality, relatively cheap food. But there are those who fear Australia could lose control of its food chain as the world's population explodes over the next 50 or 60 years, leaving billions of people struggling to find enough to eat. For the doomsayers, the increasing foreign interest in Australian food assets is a warning that shouldn't be ignored. In a country as steeped in farming as Australia, food security is not a hot-button topic. But according to experts who've studied the issue, such as the University of Technology's Professor Julian Cribb, the clock is ticking.
It is more important, in my view, than the global financial crisis, because you can do without money at a pinch, you can't do without food. It's probably more urgent than the global climatic issues, because they're going to take a long time to build up in the background. This is something that is going to happen within a generation.
In his new book, The Coming Famine, Professor Cribb paints a bleak picture of a planet where food is in very short supply. The world's population is tipped to hit 9 billion by 2050 and 11 billion just 10 years later. Food production will need to double, but many countries will be left behind, particularly those like China, which is already feeling the strain of feeding its current inhabitants.
Well, I once asked that question to some Chinese academics. I asked them what the carrying capacity of China was in the long term, and they said they thought about 640 million people. And this is against a peak population in China of the order of 1.6, 1.8 billion people. So for a period of time, China is going to have to feed probably around about 3 times as many people as it can carry in the long run.
According to Professor Cribb, this shortage of food is going to have serious implications for countries like Australia.
Australia has always had foreign ownership of some of its food assets, but in time to come, as countries become more and more nervous about their own food security, we will see much increasing emphasis on trying to acquire Australian food assets.
The evidence suggests that process is already underway. Just this month, Singapore-based Wilmar outbid China's Bright Foods to buy CSR's sucrage and sugar division. At $1.8 billion, that deal is being heavily scrutinised by the Foreign Investment Review Board, but others are not. An increasing number of prime Australian farms are being purchased by overseas companies. For example, Victoria's largest land sale this year was the transfer of the Mount Elephant station in the west of the state to a company in Sweden. The Packer family has sold 17 properties to a British private equity firm. The American pastoral giant Westchester has paid $40 million for properties at Moree in New South Wales and Glenfine in Victoria, whilst a company registered in Bahrain is running its eye over the vast Cubby station in southeast Queensland. Bill Heffernan is the chairman of the Senate inquiry into food production. He shares Professor Julian Cribb's concerns about the surge in foreign investment in Australian agricultural assets.
We're asleep in Australia to the fact that a lot of places around the world, such as China, India and the Arab states, are looking at where they're going to be in 40 or 50 years' time, and they're making provision now for their food task in the future.
Which, according to Bill Heffernan, eventually could see Australian farmers becoming tenants in their own country.
Because we are an attractive destination for safe capital investment, we will lose control of our destiny to outsiders, and the worst of that will be government outsiders.
A look at the Tasmanian dairy industry provides some salutary insights.
It's actually costing us to go to work. We're actually going to work, doing our job, and at the end of the day we're getting a bill for doing our job. How many people do you know that do that? No one.
In the Apple Isle, dairy farmers have had enough. Their industry is dominated by 2 foreign-owned companies, New Zealand's Fonterra and Japan's Kirin. Milk prices at the farm gate have been slashed to the point where farmers say they can no longer make a profit.
We've been milking 25 years and our farm is really our super fund, like a lot of farmers, and we're just seeing that going down the drain.
For Bill Heffernan, it's a classic case of how Australians can be the big losers when foreign investment is allowed to go unchecked.
I chaired the milk inquiry in Tasmania as well, you see. Took evidence down there and like 26 cents a litre. Can I tell your viewers that this is a con job on farmers?
The irony is that although foreign investment has contributed to the plight of Tasmanian dairy farmers, for many of them foreign investment could also be the only hope of escape. With no Australian buyers coming forward for their farms, estate agents are hawking them overseas. One agent alone has 40 farms she's trying to sell in China.
No one wants to see our farms sold out to another country. There's not one of us want to see that. But what do? Do we sit back with our hands tied and go broke and lose everything?
The answer for many people connected with agricultural industries is for Australia's foreign investment laws to be tightened. Behind me is Sydney's Pyrmont Dock, where tens of thousands of immigrants began their new lives in Australia. Immigration, of course, is a key issue in the federal election campaign, with both sides unashamedly pandering to those who, for whatever reason, don't want Australia's population to get much bigger. Business has a different view on that, though. For example, the chairman of Australia Post has warned there'll be big problems ahead if immigration is wound back.
The reality is that we do have skills shortages in this country, and it's if we continue to grow and prosper, as I would hope we will, then we're going to have to address that. And one of the ways of addressing it is through immigration. Generally speaking, the immigration component of our growth has been very important to us. And I don't think that's going to change, frankly. I think it's important that we continue to have a positive and strong immigration policy. It's good for this country, it's good for growth, it's good for employment, and it's essential for skills.
An issue that's been in the headlines all year is what's known as sovereign risk. It came to the fore with the huge government debt problems in Europe, and then as the miners battled the federal government over the resources super profits tax, they also talked repeatedly of sovereign risk. But what is sovereign risk, and what does it mean for you and me? Well, I put those questions to the international economist at the Lowy Institute, Mark Thirlwell. Mark, what's the definition of sovereign risk?
I guess the strict definition is that it's the risk that the sovereign or the government will default on its obligations, as in it won't pay back its debt in full.
So we've heard a lot about countries like Greece possibly defaulting on their debt. What does that mean for the man in the street? How does it affect the public?
Sovereign risk, when it gets to that extreme, can be really bad news for you. I mean, the last big crisis we had was Argentina in 2001, which was the biggest sovereign default on record to date. What happens is governments get themselves into a terrible position. Basically, they reach a point where they have a choice between defaulting on their obligations or implementing really tough fiscal austerity packages. Basically, what that means is they have to jack tax rates up to try and generate the money in order to pay creditors, or they have to slash government spending, again, in order to save money so they can redirect it towards servicing the debt, or they have to do both. When they do those kind of things, you get the hits from lost government spending programs, you get the hit from higher taxation, and also you get an overall economic hit, because those things tend to drag down your economy. So your economy tends to be shrinking as well. And as growth shrinks, your budget position gets worse, your ability to repay gets worse, so it all gets harder and harder, at which point you start to spiral downwards. If things go particularly badly wrong, governments at that point decide, look, it's all too hard, and they either get what's a voluntary restructuring, in which case they talk cooperatively to their creditors and convince them to renegotiate the debt, or they do an involuntary restructuring, which is basically a default. If you default, the problem then is you can't access external borrowing anymore, at least for a while, until the market's forgotten that you're a defaulter. And at that point, if you can't borrow anything, you can't run deficits, so the pressure to close that gap between government spending and taxation hits you all at once, and all the adjustments that maybe you'd like to have stretched out over time got compressed into a very short period of time. Higher unemployment, higher taxes, lower activity. If it all goes wrong, it's a really grim story.
We've just been through the miners' stoush with the federal government over the resources super profits tax, and the miners were repeatedly talking about sovereign risk, but I imagine that's a different sovereign risk to the one we've just been discussing.
They were. This wasn't the sort of narrow definition that I talked about before. This is a broader one. It's more like regulatory risk, if you like. I mean, here what they're talking about is the risk that governments change the rule of the game on you. So what they're saying is when you look to invest in a country, one of the things that you'll take into mind is the regulatory environment around you. What governments will tax you, how governments will tax you, what rate they'll tax you at, what regulations they'll impose. There's a risk associated with that changing, if you like, and changing in a way that's adverse to the company affected. So what they're talking about is a change in the conditions under which they're doing business. Because that change was coming from government policy, they call it sovereign risk.
Was it the right term?
I'm not sure it was. I mean, it was an effective term. It was an effective term to use in the debate. It's certainly not a traditional measure of sovereign risk. And as I say, it cuts, for example, the statements that we got hearing saying, well, what this does is it makes Australia, much more risky. It makes Australia a place where you have a sovereign risk challenge. When you look at all those traditional indicators of sovereign risk, that just didn't ring true. But as a debating tool, it was pretty effective. And it did capture something about it. I mean, it did capture the point of the argument that we were making, which was that, well, government is changing the rules under which we're doing our investment. So it did capture something about that.
Well, just finally, for businesses, how do you manage sovereign risk?
You manage it in a variety of ways, I guess. I mean, there's a whole bunch. We saw some of them, I guess, in operation during that mining debate. One of them, of course, is that you lobby governments, and you lobby them quite furiously if you think that they're going to change the environment in which you're operating. Do you try and stop them doing it, or to try and convince them that they should take your interests into account? Other ways that you would do it is that you spread your risks. You look across different countries. If you're an investor going into a country for the first time, you obviously want to understand the regulatory environment, the sovereign risk environment going into that country. So you do your research, you do your analysis, and then the key one is you have to be forward-looking. You can't assume that the way an existing or given sovereign risk profile is going to be that way forever. It's going to change quite dramatically.
Mark Thurwell, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm outside the headquarters of upmarket retailer David Jones, a company still trying to limit the damage from the sex scandal which cost Chief Executive Mark McGuinness his job. There's an important lesson from the Mark McGuinness case for all people who run a business. And that lesson is your personal behaviour on all issues matters and has a big impact which is felt right throughout the organisation.
The chief executive is the role model for the whole company. So if the chief executive is behaving inappropriately, it sets out a message that inappropriate behaviour is okay. If the chief executive is behaving inappropriately, it actually affects the way that people function throughout the whole organisation in the subtlest way, which actually can lead to multi-million-dollar error.
If you have a question on anything to do with money or business, we'd love to hear from you and we'll do our best to try to find the answer for you. Our email address is thefinancequarter@your.abc.net.au. Thank you for watching and we'll see you next time on The Finance Quarter.